Today's title of the discussion is Food Intolerances and Their Effect on Behavior, the Enzyme Solution. Today we're talking to Tom Bohager, who is founder of Autism Hope Alliance and founder and chairman of Enzymedica. He's also the author of Enzymes, What the Experts Know, and Everything You Need to Know About Enzymes. Welcome, Tom.
My pleasure. Well, good to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about enzymes and the behavior, especially with those individuals on the autism spectrum. And how did you get involved in autism?
Well, about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, there was a woman, a mother of two autistic children. Her name was Karen DeFelice. She passed a couple of years ago. But Karen had written a book about enzymes and autism. And in the book, she had recommended our products, Enzymedica products. And so we began getting lots of calls at our office about the role of enzymes with autism. And quite frankly, we really didn't even know how to answer them. And when we determined that it was coming from people who were reading her book, we reached out to her to get a better understanding. And eventually I met Karen not long after that original conversation, and she helped really educate me on the connection between digestive distress and autism and the role of enzymes, of course, which I knew a lot about digestive distress, but knew very little about autism at the time. And so for the following 5 years, Enzymedica sponsored Karen wherever she spoke, which simply means that we helped offset the cost of her travel and her staying in different places all over the country. Her goal was to educate as many parents as possible about some alternative solutions to helping their children with autism. And one of those solutions happened to be Enzyme, which was one of her passions. And so that's where it all began. And about 5 years or 6 years after all of that, I met you at a very large event in Anaheim, California. And you kind of finished what she started. You know, obviously, for those of you that don't know, Kristin, who is our host today, has been involved with educating parents for about the same time we've been connected, right, Kristin? About 5 years?
Actually, about 10 years, because we've been connected for about 8.
Well, I thought Enzymedica was 16 years old, so don't take that personally.
No worries.
So
Again, the time's flying by because we're having fun.
Telling you, I must have met Karen 13 or 14 years ago then. It's just unbelievable. So anyway, so Kristin, you've obviously been a big part in helping me understand many other facets of this diagnosis and how we can help families. We've even developed some products based on your input and your expertise. So I've been involved in autism ever since that first connection with Karen, and you've really been instrumental in helping me understand even more.
And when you're talking about autism, because clearly I understand the digestive enzyme piece of it, there must have been some type of passion of what made you want to help these children and the children and the families out there.
Yeah, I don't have any children that have been diagnosed with autism. I have a nephew who was diagnosed with Asperger's, but that was long after I got involved. You know, quite frankly, it was the realization that the children that are diagnosed with autism, that are on the spectrum, the vast majority of these have severe digestive distress. And just coming to an appreciation of that and knowing what enzymes can do to help offset and even eliminate many of those symptoms is why I got involved, because I really felt like we could help. We could help thousands, if not tens of thousands, of families with our expertise in helping children curb some of their cravings, benefit from the nutrition in their food, and alleviate some of the most common symptoms that are associated with this type of digestive distress. So really just knowing that we could help children is what really motivated me to get as involved as I am.
And what is the prevalence of digestive issues in autism spectrum disorders?
Well, most of the references that you'll find is usually between 70 and 85%. We did a poll several years ago, and we polled over 200 families and asked them all sorts of questions about the supplements that they use and why they use them. And in the poll that we did, we found that right at 80% of the families that we polled, their children were suffering from severe distress, which is very much in line with what you'll find elsewhere. So 8 out of 10 children who are diagnosed with autism are likely suffering from some form of distress, digestively speaking. That's been our experience, at least.
And what are their symptoms?
Well, I classify them in really 2 ways. I call them, what's obvious in the way of symptoms, and then what's really not so obvious. So, when we think of digestive distress, we think, and I say we, is all those listening adults that are not on the spectrum. When we have gas, bloating, indigestion, heartburn, we associate that with digestive distress. So stomach pain, constipation, diarrhea, and then some of the other symptoms that are obvious as well, but maybe not as obvious to some people, are dark circles under the eyes, which may be an indication they're not really benefiting from their foods as well as they should be. Fatigue is also linked into that, and food particles in stools. If relatively easy to digest foods end up in the stools. I'm not talking about corn or high fiber, but things that most of us can easily break down. Then those are some of the obvious symptoms of poor digestion and digestive distress. And then there's a host of diseases and diagnoses that have names, whether it be irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease or whatever it might be. There's all these other diseases, all, of course, indicating that there's digestive distress. And then you have what I consider to be the not-so-obvious symptoms. When we think of hyperactivity or poor memory, moody behavior, constant hunger, sleep problems, many of the children on the spectrum are extremely picky eaters. They may only have a handful of foods that they want and are willing to eat. And yet these, although not nearly as obvious as the discomfort symptoms, are also symptoms of poor digestion. And at the very least, they are not getting what they need from the food that they are consuming, which may ultimately explain why they're having these challenges. And so quite a few symptoms, but the obvious and the not so obvious.
And so I know a lot of the parents that are listening, it's kind of confusing when you're looking at a food allergy versus an intolerance. Can you maybe help explain the differences between the two?
Sure. So very often when someone has digestive distress, whether it's an obvious symptom or a not so obvious symptom, one of the things that we often look to is allergies. And secondarily, we may be looking at food intolerances. And so it's really important. It's a great question because it's really important to understand the differences. A food allergy, simply put, is it's a reaction by the body to something that we've consumed where the body has identified something within that food as being essentially dangerous, as being non-self, and it needs to be removed. And so what that means is, in simple terms, is that there is an immune response. Now, in extreme cases, this immune response can be life-threatening. So we might think of a peanut allergy, where there's anaphylaxis and the throat swells and the child or the adult, for that matter, may stop breathing as a result of an allergic reaction. That's an extreme. And what that involves is something called immunoglobulin E, which is responsible for an immediate histamine release to the body in this drastic reaction. And so those are the most obvious. Secondarily, there's what we call food sensitivity. And here we would see also other immunoglobulins at play, immunoglobulin G, A, and M. But these are delayed reactions. And so very often when someone takes a test for allergies, they'll do a blood draw and they'll look for certain antibodies, or they may do skin pricks where they introduce to the skin through a small prick some compounds that might create a reaction. And the way a reaction is determined is how the skin responds to the prick over time. And the real challenge with food sensitivities, which, by the way, are also immune responses, is that there's often a delayed reaction which could last hours or days. And so this can be really difficult to diagnose. And often you need, obviously, a doctor or a clinician who specializes in allergies to determine this. Because when your symptoms are hours and days apart from your actual consumption of these foods that are causing the sensitivity, you don't always notice them. And you might not always notice them in your child either. But these two are immune responses, and those are also classified technically as an allergic response. Now, food intolerances are very different from that. You know, if the most common food intolerance that most people have heard of is lactose intolerance. And so lactose intolerance is an intolerance to a dairy sugar, and the dairy sugar is lactose. And so a simple solution to a food intolerance is to consume lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. And so the biggest difference between a food intolerance and an allergy, or what we might also classify as a sensitivity, is that one's an immune reaction, the other is not. And a food intolerance can truly be defined as an enzyme deficiency. So in the case of lactose intolerance, the body is not making a sufficient amount of the enzyme lactase, and therefore when you consume lactose, you're having symptoms of intolerance, which is often bloating and diarrhea in the case of lactose. So what's important to realize is that there are many food intolerances out there. There's gluten intolerance, there's disaccharide intolerance, which is essentially a sugar intolerance. There's phenols that people are often intolerant to, and there's lactose and casein. You know, so the list goes on. The good thing about the intolerances is that if you can introduce enzymes that digest these foods or the compounds in these foods, then you can often alleviate the common symptoms associated with it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is the best solution. And I think we're going to be talking about later is the importance of eliminating the foods that create some of these symptoms too.
Now, you talked about enzymes addressing certain food intolerances. Are there specific enzymes that can do that?
Yeah, there absolutely are. So we mentioned the most obvious, which is lactose intolerance. There's an enzyme called lactase. Another compound or molecule in dairy is casein. Now, casein is a protein found in dairy, but it's also used as a food additive elsewhere, not necessarily in dairy. And casein is broken down by specific protease enzymes. So you've got lactase, you've got protease enzymes. Gluten is a type of peptide, essentially. It's what we're sensitive to or intolerant to. It's not amino acids per se. So if I could just back up. Proteins are combinations of amino acids. And so if you picture a pearl necklace, each pearl in that necklace could represent an amino acid. The full combination of all those pearls that make up a long pearl necklace we would call a protein. But if you were to cut that pearl necklace into 3 pieces, it would then become peptides. And then if you were to cut that pearl necklace into each individual pearl, they would be amino acids. And so what most people are sensitive to, allergic to, or intolerant to in the protein world are peptides. So there's a peptidase that is extremely helpful at breaking down gluten, which is, as many parents know and people that are listening realize, is one of the more common intolerances with individuals that have been diagnosed with autism. And then phenols, there's an enzyme called xylanase, which has shown to be very, very helpful with phenols, though I will say, if you do your research on phenols and xylanase, you'll find that the jury's still out as to how it works and why it works. There's no clear path between phenols and the enzyme xylanase. And then disaccharides might be maltase and other amylase-type enzymes. So I've mentioned a lot. I think that the way I would summarize your question, or the answer to your question, is there are absolutely specific enzymes that address food intolerances. And if you can recognize what the intolerance is and identify the enzyme that helps break down that compound or that molecule, then very often there's quite a drastic or even a dramatic change of events in our response to these foods.
Now, I know on Enzymedica's website, you guys have like a simple test somebody can kind of take to see what they're intolerant to, and then kind of guides them to which enzymes to take. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's helpful. So we have an enzyme deficiency test, and it asks about your favorite foods and also the foods that cause you the most problems. And by the way, kind of just an interesting anecdote with regard to our favorite foods and foods that cause us the most problems is they tend to be the same. So people that tend to have a negative response to dairy tend to love dairy. And people that have a negative response to pasta tend to love pasta. It's kind of an unfortunate consequence, and there's different reasons to explain that. But this enzyme deficiency test goes through the foods that you like, the foods you're sensitive to or intolerant to, and then some historical questions about your health and immune function and things like that. And then based on your responses, we're able to get real close to what you likely are dealing with from an enzyme deficiency perspective. And we can recommend very specific products as a result, or if nothing else, we can tell you what enzyme you need to help offset some of the symptoms you're experiencing.
And all they have to do is go to the website, Enzymedica.com, and I believe it's on the front page or somewhere near the front page, and it says, take the digest test. And
right.
It's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple test. It's not a scary test or anything.
No, there's no blood draw, so that's great.
So now what I want to know is, we talked a little bit about, you hinted about diets. What is the benefit of elimination diets?
Well, this is a kind of a loaded topic, because elimination diets work incredibly well. And I know that you're probably, through this summit, talking to a host of professionals that are truly experts in the world of elimination diets. So I'll just very quickly kind of scratch the surface, and then we can kind of connect the dots. But I will tell you this, that in my experience, in my limited experience, quite limited in comparison to some of the other experts on the summit, I have seen such dramatic results with families who eliminate specific foods that their children are either intolerant to or allergic to. And of course, the most common are gluten and casein. So, it's just profound when a child who is acting up, whether it be behavioral or they might have symptoms that are obviously express discomfort digestively, whether they're leaning over the couch and putting pressure on their tummy, or using a ball to do the same, or walking on their tippy toes, or they are just really attached to specific foods. When gluten and casein are removed from the diet, profound effects occur, and I've seen different references on this. One reference suggested that about 70% of the children who go on a gluten-free, casein-free diet experience some major benefit. And so it truly is profound. Whether that number is the latest number or not, I can't tell you, but I can tell you that I believe it. I believe 70% could be benefiting from this. And so elimination diets are critical. And most families will start out with a gluten-free, casein-free diet, which means that they remove from their diet, obviously, dairy, and they remove pastas and breads. And then, as you know, Kristin, it doesn't end there. There's, these proteins are found in so many foods. It becomes quite a challenge. But the good news is that the market has kind of caught up with the demand. It's kind of become quite common to remove, especially gluten, from one's diet, whether we have a child on the spectrum or not, because so many people have become sensitive to this. And so the choices are far better than they were 10 years ago. And you can now shop in your neighborhood grocery store and find gluten-free and casein-free foods and dairy-free foods that are relatively good. And then, of course, if you go to a health food store or a Whole Foods or a Sprouts or a Vitamin Cottage or whatever's in your town, your local health food store, you're going to find wonderful choices here. And so, in my opinion, the benefit of elimination diets is, instead of addressing what the child or the individual is sensitive to by trying to supply them with a sufficient amount of enzymes to overcome this challenge, by eliminating the diet, you're eliminating the risk. At least you're reducing the risk as greatly as you possibly can. And it is, in my opinion, the first choice when you've identified sensitivities, allergies, or intolerances in your child or loved one. And you start with this elimination diet. It is clearly, in my opinion, the foundation to overcoming some of this, the digestive distress and the behavioral issues that are so common in children with autism.
Well, and as you said, today it's becoming more of a common thing to be able to find the gluten-free sections or the gluten-free, dairy-free sections in just general markets across the country. I know almost 11 years ago when I started the diet with my son, it was nearly impossible to find any substitutions for perhaps even bread or crackers or just even butter or cheese or milks. Today we can find lots of almond milks and coconut milks and rice milk and gluten-free, dairy-free breads and different cheeses that are not really cheeses and butter substitutions, and it's a lot easier for the moms and dads out there. For the moms and dads listening, it's not as scary as it used to be, because today there are great substitutions and great other choices that we can make. So I think, when you were talking about elimination of the diets and different foods from the kids, if your child's eating something today that maybe they seem quite, frankly addicted to, you can replace that with a gluten-free, dairy-free version. And
absolutely, yeah. So it's nothing to be scared of. And then the one other thing I would add to this is, most parents start with gluten-free, casein-free. They see a benefit, often a dramatic benefit, and then the child may plateau. And that's when the parent will often start looking at other types of foods to eliminate. There's the specific carbohydrate diet, there's the GAPS diet, there's the body ecology diet, and I'm sure you're talking to experts in all of these. But they're all essentially different forms of elimination. And what I mean by that is it incorporates different types of food, but they also provide you with alternatives to the foods that you're removing. And the only other thing I would say about elimination diets, which I think is important, is just some advice. And that is that it tends to work much better when the entire family participates. And that is not easy, but I highly recommend it, and for a couple of reasons. If you have, two parents in the home, or one parent, one caregiver, it doesn't really matter. The caregiver and perhaps another child that is not on the spectrum participating, there's a measure of empathy there that is unavoidable when you're participating in the elimination diet. But it also reduces the risk and the temptation of giving the child, the food that they're craving in the early stages of the diet. So the only little piece of advice I would give is really consider, as a family, participating in this elimination together. Now, it doesn't have to last forever as a family, but I strongly recommend that it start that way. So that everybody can kind of help one another get through it, because it's a process, Kristin. You know better than anyone. It's not easy to eliminate foods that we love, but if we're doing it together, there's strength in numbers, and so I would have the families consider that.
Absolutely, and it also helps the child not feel, basically different. He makes it feel like everybody's doing it. So you're right. It's a lot easier to do it as a family. Now, you talked about enzymes. I know there's people that are listening that may not know what an enzyme is. What are enzymes?
Well, enzymes are, most people that have heard the term have usually heard it in combination with the word digestive or digestion, and enzymes play a critical role in the digestive process. So what they simply do is they break down the foods that we eat into smaller pieces, so small, eventually, that we're able to absorb the nutrients in those foods all the way to a cellular level. But the way we would define an enzyme, that's how people have heard of them, and those are, critical to healthy digestion, of course. But enzymes are technically proteins. They are considered catalysts, and a catalyst is most often something that speeds up a reaction. So, for example, a catalyst can allow oil and water to mix. If you were to take olive oil and pour it in a glass of water, it would float to the top. And the way you would have those two mix, you would speed up that reaction is you might add an enzyme called lipase, which breaks down fats, and you'd be able to observe these two things mixing. But when you think of speeding things up, think in terms of digestion. If you were to take any type of food, let's say a protein bar, and open it up and leave it on the table, how long would it take for that energy bar to completely break down? Well, many years, most likely, if no animals got to it. And yet, when you chew it up and you consume it, the enzymes in your digestive system break that bar down in a matter of hours, quite frankly, and you benefit from that nutrition in that bar in a matter of hours and a day or two, depending on how full your stomach is and how efficient your system is. And so they're catalysts to speed up reaction, made up of proteins. But interestingly, they're not just for digestion. And this is where the story really starts, takes another turn, because enzymes are critical to every reaction within the cell. And what that simply means is that without enzymes, no cellular function could take place. So there are thousands of enzymes that are reacting within the trillions of cells of our bodies. So if you just think in terms, most people believe there's somewhere between 50 to 100 trillion cells in our body, and each of these cells has, let's say, 2,000 enzymes, which is probably very accurate. Now we're talking about numbers we can't even comprehend. Yet these enzymes are responsible for every reaction within that cell. And so we would not be able to see without enzymes. We would not be able to talk without enzymes. Our heart would not beat. We would not be able to inhale. We would not be able to metabolize foods or benefit from nutrition without enzymes. They are truly an essential part of living. They're fascinating, but they're technically proteins. And one other thing I would say that's fascinating about enzymes, in my opinion, of course, I love enzymes, so I'm probably boring those who are listening, but I love this topic, is that enzymes have and contain what a layperson might call energy, what a scientist would call biological activity. So when we think of protein, let's think of the tissue, like our skin or our muscle tissue. That's technically protein. When we look at the protein in muscle tissue, there is no biological activity. There is no energy. These muscles require energy to contract, but there's no energy inherent in the protein. Whereas in an enzyme, there is energy or biological activity, and this energy is condensed in what is called the active site of the enzyme. And it's at that active site that enzymes are able to break down foods into smaller particles. They break down proteins into peptides and amino acids, and fats into essential fatty acids, and carbohydrates into sugars. It's just phenomenal. And scientists, can't explain it. They can't explain how this protein, simply made up of amino acids, these are not living organisms. It's not like probiotics or bacteria. They're not alive. But this combination of amino acids does create a form of energy that is able to break things down and speed up reactions, and it's quite fascinating. It's so fascinating that one scientist suggested that we not classify enzymes as proteins at all because they contain this activity. We need to come up with a new name, and that scientist was Dr. Edward Howell. He wrote a book called Enzyme Nutrition, which is absolutely one of my favorite books, a book I would highly recommend. But that's how I would define enzyme.
And I think when you're sitting there saying, the people will be bored listening, I think it's so fascinating to listen about. I know when I first learned about enzymes, I couldn't understand why it wasn't on the 5 o'clock news because enzymes do so much. So I'm excited for our listeners to be able to hear about it. Now, how do enzymes help with digestion?
So I kind of touched on that a bit. They make our food particles smaller, but what I didn't talk about is how, where the enzymes are located. So interestingly, it starts at the very beginning of the digestive process. When we chew our foods, in our saliva, there are 3 different types of enzymes that break down starches or carbohydrates. So we're talking about bread and pasta and sweets and even vegetables and fruits are all made up of these carbohydrates. So there are 3 amylases in our saliva. We swallow that with the saliva, and those amylases, start breaking down the carbohydrates into sugars. Then the food moves into the lower stomach. And in the lower stomach, we have hydrochloric acid, which in effect is not an enzyme, but it liquefies the food. And we have an enzyme that breaks down protein called pepsin, and it starts breaking down the protein. And then this solution, this food in a liquid form enters the small intestine, and something fascinating occurs. There is an inventory taken of what's been digested and what hasn't. And signals are sent to the pancreas to manufacture proteases, amylases, and lipases to finish the process. So your fat digestion occurs in your small intestine, but if for some reason you've overconsumed protein or you've overconsumed carbohydrates and your body just hasn't been able to break it down in the previous portions of the digestive system, then more enzymes are sent. And this is called the law of adaptive secretion. And so as this solution moves from the small intestine into the large, in the large intestine, water is removed from that solution, and we're absorbing all through the small intestine, by the way, these nutrients. And finally, the waste is eliminated. Now, one thing I will say is that there are foods that contain enzymes that can really assist in this process, and these are raw foods, because in all raw foods, there are enzymes that are active that can help really lower the demand placed on the body to manufacture digestive enzymes. So one of the healthy things to do is consume more raw vegetables and raw fruits. Although, and again, I know some of your speakers are going to touch on this, fermented foods can be extremely beneficial, especially vegetables. It's kind of a pre-digestive, if you will. But regardless, the enzymes found in raw foods or foods that have not been heated above 180 degrees can be very, very beneficial because they assist in this digestive process. But I will say this, some who have severe digestive distress do not do well with uncooked vegetables in particular because of the fiber content. And there's a probiotic explanation there too. But nonetheless, that's how I would describe enzymes and digestion.
Now, should enzymes be used instead of elimination diets?
Absolutely not. It's not an alternative to an elimination diet, but enzymes can be used in conjunction with an elimination diet, and they work extremely well that way. And here's how they work. So let's say we've identified gluten and casein as something that we or a loved one or one of our children cannot consume because they're either intolerant to it, sensitive to it, or allergic to it. And we eliminate gluten and casein from their diet. Well, the problem is that regardless of what they're sensitive to or intolerant to, there is hidden gluten and hidden casein and so many different things. It could be soap. It could be lunch meats. It could be toys. It could be, and depending if you live near a bakery, it could be in the air. So it's just amazing the exposure that we have, especially to gluten, but to also casein. And so what I suggest individuals do is if they're sensitive to these foods or intolerant to these foods, regardless of whether or not they're consuming them, there is always a risk of exposure. And so to truly eliminate the symptoms associated, and this is another key component, and to truly detoxify the body from the gluten or the casein or the phenols or whatever it is that we're trying to address, enzymes can assist with both. So it picks up the slack with any unintended exposure, and there's a detoxifying element that the enzymes provide that can make the elimination of those foods even more beneficial than without enzymes. But again, to your point, one does not substitute for the other. So do not consider taking an enzyme that breaks down gluten and casein as a substitute for eliminating gluten and casein. One more note on this topic. As the child ages and begins to experience the benefits of these lifestyle changes, the digestive system may begin to heal, and often does. And what you will sometimes find is later in life, the sensitivity or the intolerance is not as nearly pronounced as it was in the early years. And so some children, some parents, some caregivers will begin to dabble with reintroducing some of these foods. And you have to be careful about this, but the fact of the matter is parents do this. And so if they are considering that, years later, then there's an opportunity to take these enzymes with those foods to truly reduce that risk. And then the last thing I would mention is that whenever we take our children away from our own kitchens and we eat either at friends' homes or restaurants, you can never be sure that there is an exposure. And so, as you like to say, Kristin, if you didn't make it, take it. And that's always something that we should consider. If we didn't personally make the food ourselves, we should probably take an enzyme with that food to eliminate the risk.
And, when you're talking to the parents out there, so many of us, especially when you're first starting, everything that Tom is talking about, I can personally say we've been through with my own son, and it is true. You go from one diet to another diet and see what kind of works for you. So in that elimination of these diets, sometimes it's not the first diet you start off with, it might be the second or the third, and to really just not give up, because every child's different, everybody's unique, and not everybody's the same. And so it's exciting to know that these enzymes can definitely play a huge role. And talking about that, can enzymes help in any other ways?
Yeah, enzymes can. For example, enzymes are typically taken with food. So if you're handling a digestive issue, then you would ideally take your enzymes at the beginning of the meal, and that gives the enzymes the greatest opportunity to help break down the foods that you've consumed. But sometimes we forget to take it at the beginning of the meal. So I tell everyone that take it when you remember, but ideally at the beginning of the meal. And quite frankly, the most beneficial way to take enzymes is one in the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. But few people are going to do that. So at the beginning of the meal, and then, of course, if you don't take it then, as soon as you remember, it could be an hour later, there's still a benefit, because the digestive process is a slow process. Take your enzymes. Now, with regard to other ways, when you take it away from food, so those, with food is clearly for digestive benefit. When you take it away from food, we're looking for something completely different. We're looking for benefits systemically. And when we use that word systemically, what we're simply trying to describe is other systems of the body beyond the digestive system. And the way we use these therapeutic or these systemic enzymes is we take them on an empty stomach. And the way we define an empty stomach is about 1 hour before or 2 hours after a meal. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the enzymes in the digestive tract without a lot of food, without a lot of competition, where the enzymes won't break down those foods, and some of those enzymes will be absorbed into the body, into the bloodstream, and be distributed, all throughout the body. Now, why would we want to do that? It goes back to, my description of enzymes in every cell. And I failed to mention this, but it's important to know, when we're talking about these enzymes working in cells, we're talking about metabolic enzymes. So they're digestive enzymes, and they're metabolic enzymes. And so when we want to have a therapeutic response, we want to somehow influence another system of the body. And it's important to know that, for example, the immune system is highly dependent on enzymes. And the enzymes that it's highly dependent on are enzymes called proteases or proteolytic. And these are enzymes that break down protein. So interestingly, the things that make us sick, the things that we might, let's say, how do I say this without getting in trouble? Maybe we inhale something that makes us sick on an airplane. Let's say that happens. And our body needs to identify the risk, identify it as harmful, and then tag it for removal, and then the body needs to remove it. Well, in every part of that process, enzymes are a key component. In fact, there's a system in the body called the complementary system, which complements the immune system. And the complementary system is nothing more than enzymes that are designed to remove things that can make us sick, whether they be introduced by air or by touch or any other way. So there's an enormous amount of research on immune function and enzymes. Candida is another big one, candidiasis and candida. The candida cells have a coating on it, if you will. They're surrounded by something called chitin. Chitin closely resembles fibrin, or excuse me, not fibrin, but cellulose, plant cellulose, and the enzyme cellulase helps break down that compound, that component of the cell, the chitin. And so there's a huge benefit there. Inflammatory challenges, enzymes increase circulation. They support the entire cardiovascular system. There's airborne allergies that can be we can be aided with specific enzymes that not only help identify and remove the allergic compound, but also help us with nasal congestion. There are enzymes that are called mucolytic, which if we have a mucus problem, it helps break down mucus. I'm telling you, it really is remarkable. It's why I get so excited about the topic. Most people would not believe how many different things that we have to deal with in our life, which are considered, detrimental to our health, that enzymes can help offset and support. It truly is remarkable.
Is there a benefit in blending enzymes?
Absolutely. So a blend of enzymes is always more beneficial than a single enzyme. So, for example, if you want to break down casein, and we've been able to prove this, you're much better off using 4 proteases to break down casein than 1 protease to break down. It's something that Enzymedica that we started, and I'm not trying to promote our company, but it is a fact. It's something we started about 16 years ago. So 2 years after we began the company, we started looking at the benefits of blending enzymes. And when we say blend, here's what we mean. We're not talking about taking 1 lipase, 1 amylase, 1 cellulase, and 1 protease for fat, carbohydrate, fiber, and protein digestion and blending that. What we're saying is that if you want to break down protein, it's best to blend multiple enzymes that break down protein with multiple enzymes or blends that break down fat, with multiple enzymes that break down carbohydrates. And there's 2 main reasons for this. One is that enzymes work in a very specific environment, which means they work in a very specific pH. And so the acid environment of the stomach, you can get 1 or 2 enzymes working in that acid environment to break down a protein or a carbohydrate. And then as it leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine, it goes from acid, passes through neutral, and into an alkaline environment. And so if you have enzymes that break down protein that love alkalinity and the neutral environment, the neutral pH, then you're going to get great digestion there. And so what you end up doing when you create these blends, and we call it TheraBlend at Enzymedica, but when you create these blends, is the enzymes work for a much longer period of time in the system, in the digestive system. And so we have parents tell us all the time that we've tried products that aren't blended and they just don't seem to work. And we've tried your products or products that are blended and they work so much better. And it stands to reason that they would. So reason number 1 is they are very specific, and you need to combine enzymes that like different environments, different pHs. The other reason it's important to blend enzymes is no single enzyme can break down a complete protein, a complete carbohydrate, or a complete fat. You need multiple proteases to completely break down protein and multiple lipases to completely break down fats and so on and so forth. And so having these combined, you're breaking down more proteins, fats, fiber, and carbohydrates, and you're doing it over a longer period of time. So blending is truly essential in trying to determine if a product is a high-quality product or not.
And what would you suggest when choosing an enzyme product?
So first, see what it is that they do. There's a lot of enzyme products on the market. I highly recommend that you look for somebody that specializes within the enzyme category. In other words, don't buy your enzymes from a company that's known to make, let's say, multivitamins. They've got 200 types of multivitamins and they've got 2 enzyme products. That's not your best choice. Or they make herbal products and they have 1 enzyme product. look for a company that has a wide variety of enzyme products that clearly specializes in the category. And look for a product that is blended. So it should say amylase blend or amylase therablend, lipase blend, protease blend. That's absolutely critical. And then, look at the feedback online. It's one of the greatest tools we have now. Look at what customers are saying about the products that they're purchasing, and it's so easy to find now these opinions that they can be very valuable.
Now, I know, for example, for Enzymedica, they have capsules. What happens if a child can't swallow a capsule yet? What would you recommend?
They can open a capsule. There's a couple ways they can get the child to consume it. They can open the capsule. They can put it maybe in a little bit of applesauce, like a spoonful we're talking, very quickly try to get the child to swallow it. It might be a little easier to use a syringe of sorts, the little bulb syringes. I like the ones where the bulb comes off the back, and I'll put the enzymes in that little bulb and then put a little water in there or a little juice, shake it up real good, put it back together, and then just try to squirt it in. And if you can do it in a little juice, that can be really helpful because there's the enzymes don't taste bad, but they taste a little yeasty is how I would describe them. They're certainly not sweet, so something to consider. That you can hide it stuff. Some people will hide it in a smoothie. You can do yogurt, but I'm telling you, it digests yogurt very fast, so you have to be quick. But
it becomes a science project, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, experiment with it.
And they give it on the first bite of food, correct?
Yeah, so it's always best at the very beginning of the meal is to take the enzymes, right?
And then they don't want to put it in anything hot either.
Right, because heat above 118 degrees will denature the enzymes, which makes them not effective. It would be useless if it got too hot.
And we talked about the books that you've written, Enzymes, What the Experts Know, and Everything You Need to Know About Enzymes. Where can they find these books?
So the book, Everything You Need to Know About Enzymes, is still being published, and it's very easily found in ebook format or in softcover on Amazon or any of your popular book websites. The other publication, What the Experts Know, is no longer being published, but you can find used copies all over Amazon and eBay and places like that. So really, most of the websites you'll be able to find either of those publications. And of course, you can always contact us at Enzymedica, and we can help you find these things as well. We can ship them to you.
And the website for Enzymedica is just enzymedica.com.
Yeah, so Enzymedica is ENZY Medica. So Enzy, ENZY, MEDICA.com.
Thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time and talking to our families. In closing, is there anything that you want to make sure families know about?
Just one thing I think is worth mentioning, and that is that people confuse all the time probiotics and enzymes. And what I would just simply say is enzymes and probiotics are not the same. Probiotics are living microorganisms. Enzymes are proteins. Probiotics manufacture enzymes, and it's one of the reasons why probiotics are so helpful is the enzymes they manufacture help us digest more food. So don't confuse probiotics with enzymes, and don't think that just because you're taking a probiotic, you're getting a sufficient amount of enzymes. They're very, very different from one another. Both are recommended, and they work very, very well together, which is why we combine them all the time in the same product. So we didn't spend any time on that. I thought it'd be useful.
That's definitely something that we get asked a lot, and I think that's going to be very helpful to the families out there. Again, Tom,
Right.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, to the listeners out there, if you guys want to learn more about what Tom was talking about, feel free to visit enzymedica.com and also be able to make sure to check out his book, Everything You Need to Know About Enzymes, or also look for the book, Enzymes, What the Experts Know. Thanks again, Tom.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Kristin. Bye.